Imagine being taken from your village. You're chained, branded, and thrown onto a ship heading somewhere unknown. The air's thick with sickness. People are packed so tight you can barely move, and your fellow captives are dying like flies. Those who survive are sold to strangers. That's only the beginning of what waits on the other side. This is the disturbing slavery iceberg. Tier 1. The Code of Hammurabi. Contrary to what many people think, slavery wasn't born in the colonies. It was written into civilization itself. The Code of Hammurabi, carved around 1750 BCE in ancient Babylon, is one of the oldest surviving legal codes in human history, and a huge chunk of it spelled out how people could be owned, traded, and punished. King Hammurabi ruled the Babylonian Empire, which covered much of modern-day Iraq, and he was determined to bring order to a growing chaotic society where everyone from merchants to farmers was arguing about something. So he carved 282 laws on a big black stone pillar and placed it in a temple so anyone could read it, or get someone else to read it for them. The code covered everything from business deals to marriage, but slavery took up a good chunk of it. It didn't question whether slavery was right. It just made it official. The laws treated slaves as property, with a few management tips thrown in. If a slave talked back, they could lose an ear. If someone bought a slave and later found out they were sick or had a defect, they could return said slave and get their money back. If someone helped a slave escape, that person could be executed. Killing a slave wasn't considered murder. It was just property damage, and the killer only had to compensate the owner. But slavery in Babylon went beyond just the rules for punishment or ownership. It was woven into everyday life and the economy. You could sell yourself, your spouse, or your kids to pay off debt. The code said debt slaves should be freed after 3 years, but most never made it that long. Some worked on farms or royal projects, while others worked in temples as servants of the gods, which just meant being owned by priests instead of regular people. Their children were born into the same status, so the system kept running even without wars or raids. Hammurabi's code also gave the world one of the first examples of a legal class system. The punishment you got depended entirely on who you were. A noble and a commoner could commit the same crime and get completely different outcomes. If a noble injured another noble, he'd be punished the same way. But if he hurt a slave, a few silver shekels, Babylon's version of cash, settled the score. And if a slave hurt a noble, they could be mutilated or killed. Historians call it civilization's first legal system. A more honest description, civilization's first paperwork for keeping people in their place. It was so good at making sure the people at the bottom stayed there that versions of it appeared across Mesopotamia, Persia, and even in early Hebrew law. And that's only the beginning. In Tier 3, you'll hear about enslaved people who chose freedom by taking an impossible step. Spartan Helots. Sparta is famous for its fearsome warriors, but that image leaves out the people who actually kept the city running. At the bottom of Spartan society were the Helots, an enslaved population that formed the majority. The social hierarchy was clear. Kings sat at the top, the soldiers ran the show, and the Helots handled everything else. They planted, harvested, and delivered the food that kept the army alive. Without them, the Spartan military machine would have collapsed in a week. Their exact origin is still debated. One account says they came from Helos, a city nearby that Sparta conquered early on. The people of Helos were enslaved, and the name Helot just stuck for anyone under Spartan control. Another version said they were people from Messenia captured during the First Messenian War in the 8th century BCE. Either way, they were state-owned slaves, treated as property that could be worked, punished, or killed without consequence. The Helots were allowed to have families in small communities, and in rare cases, they could even earn freedom through military service. But in Sparta, freedom was flexible. It usually just meant being slightly less disposable. The Helots had no real rights and no way to protect themselves from abuse. Their entire existence revolved around serving a class that saw them as tools rather than people. The government also treated them as a security risk. Spartans were paranoid that one day, the Helots would realize they outnumbered their masters and rise up, which, to be fair, they eventually did. To prevent that, Sparta created the Crypteia, a secret police force made of young Spartan men. Their job was to roam the countryside at night and kill any Helot who looked too confident, too strong, or just unlucky enough to be outside. These killings were a form of psychological warfare meant to keep everyone compliant and on edge. The fear worked for a while, but you can only keep people terrified for so long before they start thinking, you know what, maybe I'll risk it. The Helots rose up more than once, but the big one hit in 464 BCE, after an earthquake wiped out half of Sparta. The survivors barely had time to dust themselves off before the Helots said, "Perfect timing," and launched what became the Great Helot Uprising. The Helots took over Mount Ithome, dug in for years, and the Spartans spent almost 5 years trying to starve them out, finally suppressing the rebellion. After the uprising, most Helots were forced back into servitude. The Spartans did make some changes afterward, but accounts vary. Some say the punishments got harsher to keep them in line. Others say that life stayed mostly the same. Either way, the Helots were still trapped in the system. Servile Wars. In the old days, Rome ran on slavery. Farmers, miners, gladiators, they were all replaceable cogs in an empire built to keep the rich comfortable. Estates in Sicily and across the Republic ran like factories. Slaves worked from sunrise to sunset, got barely enough to eat, were chained at night, and punished for the smallest mistakes. Their lives were cheap, and the system assumed that would never change. But the cracks were already forming. The constant labor and cruelty created frustration, anger, and eventually, rebellion. That rebellion sparked the Servile Wars, 3 massive uprisings between the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE that tested the power of Rome itself. The first one kicked off in 135 BCE in Sicily, which at the time was Rome's version of a food factory. The island was filled with huge estates, owned by wealthy Romans who didn't like getting their hands dirty. So they imported slaves by the thousands and worked them until they dropped. Sicilian estate owners kept slaves chained while they worked the fields from sunrise to sunset, barely fed, and locked in underground pits at night. When hunger got too bad, many turned to stealing just to stay alive. Then came Eunice, a slave who said he was a prophet and liked to perform what people thought were magic tricks. His masters used him for entertainment, but Eunice had other plans. During his little fire-breathing shows, he would casually tell the crowd that the upper class would one day be killed or enslaved, and he would become king. Everyone laughed, until he actually made it happen. When a group of slaves approached Eunice to ask how to deal with their cruel owner, he told them it was time to stop asking. They armed themselves and killed their master, Demophilus. Then they stormed the nearby city of Enna. The revolt spread fast. Eunice gathered hundreds of slaves, took control of multiple towns, and crowned himself king. He even minted coins. For a while, it actually seemed like the slaves might win, but Rome eventually overpowered them. Eunice was taken alive and died in prison soon after. About 30 years later, in 104 BCE, Sicily flared up again. The Second Servile War started after Roman authorities freed about 800 Italian slaves, but refused to free the non-Italians, who assumed the same rules applied to them. When the government ordered them back into chains, things got ugly. A man named Salvius, who renamed himself Tryphon after a Syrian king, led the rebellion. Another leader, Athenian from Cilicia, joined him. They managed to organize thousands of slaves and set up their own miniature government. Salvius even pulled a Eunice move and declared himself king. The Roman Senate didn't find that funny. They sent in the legions, and after several years of fighting, the rebellion was crushed. Thousands of slaves were killed, and Sicily went back to being Rome's breadbasket. The third and most famous uprising came in 73 BCE, this time led by Spartacus, a gladiator from Thrace. He was one of about 200 fighters at a gladiator school in Capua who decided they'd had enough of being forced to kill each other for entertainment. The escape plan failed before it started, but about 70 of them managed to fight their way out with kitchen knives and whatever they could grab. On their way out, they looted a few wagons and armed themselves properly. What started as a jailbreak turned into a full-blown war. Slaves from across the countryside joined them, and Spartacus quickly became a capable commander. His army defeated multiple Roman forces, which was embarrassing for a republic that prided itself on military power. For a while, it looked like he might actually pull it off, but Rome had other plans. The Senate sent Marcus Licinius Crassus, a general so rich he used his own money to fund armies. He finally cornered Spartacus and his followers in southern Italy. The final battle was a bloodbath. Spartacus was killed, and around 6,000 of his men were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading to Rome. The Servile Wars didn't end slavery, but they made the Senate sweat. For a few brief years, the empire remembered that when you treat people like tools, Eventually, they start using themselves as weapons. Mass uprisings are brutal no matter where they happen. In Tier 3, you'll see one that took place at sea. The Zanj Rebellion. Before Europe ever dipped its toes into the slave trade, the business was already thriving in the Middle East. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled most of the Islamic Empire at the time, slavery was pretty much a way of life. Arab traders had been moving enslaved people across Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean for centuries. Women were especially prized, often taken as concubines or forced to bear children for their owners. The men thrown into brutal labor instead. One of the worst places you could end up was the salt marshes near Basra. That's where thousands of East Africans, known as the Zanj, were sent to clear swamps and dig irrigation canals in scorching heat. The salt ate through their skin. Food was scarce, and if you slowed down or talked back, you'd be executed right there in the mud. It was the kind of job that made you wonder if death was the better option. And this cycle dragged on for decades. Whole generations grew up doing the same exhausting work, feeling the same pain, and seeing no way out. Eventually, someone had to push back. In 869 AD, a man named Ali ibn Muhammad decided he'd be the one to light the match. He wasn't enslaved himself, but he saw an opportunity and took it. He began speaking to the Zanj about their living conditions and promised them freedom, food, and wealth if they joined him. He also appealed to other poor or angry groups in Iraq: peasants, army deserters, poor farmers, pretty much anyone who had a reason to hate the Abbasids. Before long, the enslaved population started calling Ali ibn Muhammad Sahib az-Zanj, or Chief of the Zanj. The rebellion began that same year and lasted almost 15 years. The Zanj weren't exactly a trained army. They fought with whatever they could grab, but they still managed to capture cities, raid villages, and stockpile food, weapons, and horses. They even started collecting taxes and minting their own coins, which is when you know a rebellion's gotten way out of hand. They built their own capital, Al-Muqtara, meaning the chosen city, and Ali ibn Muhammad ruled like a king of his own little empire. The fighting continued, and thousands died on both sides, but the rebellion held out until 883, when Al-Muqtara finally fell, and the Abbasids massacred or re-enslaved what was left of the rebels. Irish slavery. Imagine falling asleep in a tiny fishing village on the Irish coast, and waking up chained in the hold of a pirate ship bound for North Africa. Irish slavery takes a few different shapes across history, so it helps to slow down and take it one chapter at a time. Each version looked different and shifted depending on who held power. These systems came from war, debt, or piracy, not the kind of fixed hereditary model that locked entire generations into bondage. In early Gaelic Ireland, long before the Vikings showed up looking for trouble, the lowest social class was their Flader. These were people who either lost their freedom because of debts or crimes, or people who came from outside the clan system and had no legal protection. They served Irish elites, lived at the bottom of the ladder, and could only climb up if the local lord felt generous. So at this early stage, the enslaved people were mostly other Irish folks or outsiders who somehow ended up there. Then the timeline shifted. From the 9th to the 12th century, the Vikings rolled into Ireland like they owned the place and flipped the whole situation. During the Viking era, the port of Dublin ended up becoming one of Europe's biggest slave markets. People were captured in raids around Ireland and Scotland, and then shipped off and sold to other lands. But things started changing around 1080, when William the Conqueror tightened his grip over the English and Welsh coasts. William was the Duke of Normandy who invaded England in 1066, won the Battle of Hastings, and then spent years reorganizing the place so thoroughly he left a political footprint the size of a small elephant. Once he locked down England's ports, the Viking-Irish slave pipeline didn't have the open coastline it depended on, so the trade began to shrink. By 1171, all the English men and women who had been enslaved in Ireland were freed. But that didn't mean slavery in Ireland packed its bags and left. A few centuries later, the Barbary slave raids kicked off around 1500. These raids tore through small towns and villages on the African Atlantic seaboard and along Europe's coast. Pirates, known as the Barbary Corsairs, sailed in, hit seaside towns across Italy, Spain, Greece, Ireland, and even Iceland, all with one goal: grab as many European men, women, and children as possible and sell them off somewhere far from home. You'll get the full story in Tier 5, but for now, let's move on, because Ireland wasn't done with slavery just yet. Between 1660 and 1815, Irish merchants took part in the transatlantic slave trade. In this phase, the enslaved people were Africans taken from West and Central Africa by European empires. Irish merchants invested in the trade, financed voyages, and made money off goods that came from forced labor in the Caribbean and the Americas. So at this point, Ireland wasn't the victim. It was part of the machinery. The history of slave trade in Irish history is a long, messy story with shifting roles, and nobody came out of it looking good. Tier 2. The Transatlantic Slave Trade. The transatlantic slave trade kicked off around the late 1480s and went on for more than 3 centuries. During that time, millions of African men, women, and children were ripped from their homes and shipped off to Europe and the Americas. It wasn't some economic system. No matter how neatly the books try to frame it with words like commerce, trade routes, or labor demand, what it really was a full-blown business of turning human beings into property, bought, sold, and traded for sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The Portuguese started it, with Spain following right behind. They needed cheap labor for their sugar plantations, and nothing says cheap like unpaid. At first, they brought captives taken during tribal wars, then the profits got too good. European raiders stopped pretending it was trade and started kidnapping directly. Soon, Britain, France, and the Netherlands wanted in, and the whole thing became a multinational nightmare. Along the African coast, European traders built forts and trading posts where local rulers and merchants handed over captives in exchange for guns, alcohol, and factory-made goods. Now, some people like to say that certain African leaders willingly took part in the trade, and sure, some did. But that skips the part where Europe held all the cards. The entire system ran on intimidation, manipulation, and firepower. Many of the so-called participants were just middlemen trying to survive in a setup where saying no could easily turn you into the next person in chains. Captives were chained by the ankles, tied by the neck, and forced to march for miles toward the coast. Many didn't survive that journey. Those who did were shoved onto ships for what's now known as the Middle Passage. We'll get to that in a bit, but for now, just know that millions went in, and only a portion of them lived to see the other side. Once they reached the Americas, the enslaved Africans became the foundation of an entire economy. They worked from sunrise to sunset on huge plantations that made Europe rich. The sugar was sweet, the cotton was soft, and the money just kept rolling in. But all of it came from pain. The owners lived like kings, while the people doing the work were starving and unpaid. Back in Africa, the damage was massive. Entire generations disappeared as people were captured and sold. Kingdoms crumbled under the weight of constant raids and warfare fueled by European demand for slaves. Villages that had been running fine for centuries got torn apart. Families disappeared. Farms got abandoned, and the social order just fell to pieces. The ripple effect lasted for decades, leaving scars that reshaped the continent long after the trade itself ended. Getting sold into a lifetime of pain is beyond cruel. And that's why in Tier 4, some enslaved people who had enough flipped the script, burned the plantations, and tore through the colony that kept them in chains. Elmina Castle. Elmina Castle sits on the coast of Ghana, looking calm and picture-perfect with its white walls and ocean view. But a few centuries ago, that same view was the last thing millions of Africans ever saw before being shipped off across the Atlantic. The Portuguese built it in 1482 and called it São Jorge da Mina, or St. George of the Mine. When they arrived a year earlier, they found gold everywhere and people already running a booming trade system. They saw profit and decided to set up shop. They struck a deal with the local chief, promising that if he let them build the castle, it would protect trade routes and bring mutual benefit. He agreed, probably thinking it was a fair deal at the time. So construction started. Ships came all the way from Portugal carrying stone blocks, iron bars, and workers. By the time they were done, the place looked like a fortress that could withstand anything. At first, it worked exactly how they wanted. It stored gold, not people. The Portuguese even avoided slave trading there at the beginning because they didn't want to mess up their business with the wars and chaos that came with slave raiding. That changed by the 1600s when gold stopped being enough. The transatlantic slave trade had become Europe's new obsession, and Elmina Castle was right in the middle of it. It was repurposed into a holding center where enslaved Africans from all over West Africa were chained up, branded, and stored like cargo while waiting for ships to take them to Brazil or the Caribbean. The castle changed hands in 1637 when the Dutch showed up with cannons and took it from the Portuguese. Instead of stopping the slave trade, they perfected it. They turned the chapel, yes, the place meant for prayer, into a slave auction floor. The dungeons below held hundreds of people at once, packed so tight that sitting upright was almost impossible. Disease, filth, and death were constant, but the Dutch merchants upstairs were too busy counting profits to care. In 1872, the British took control after the Dutch pulled out. Slavery had been abolished by then, so they used the castle for colonial administration. The irony was hard to miss. A place once used to imprison Africans was now being used to govern them. Today, Elmina Castle is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists come to see it, take photos, and walk through the same tunnels where people once begged for freedom. The Middle Passage. Imagine being captured, sold, and crammed onto a wooden ship with chains biting into your wrists and ankles, barely able to move, knowing the next weeks or months could be the end. That's what the Middle Passage was like for enslaved people crossing the Atlantic. Ships left ports along the West African coast stuffed with men, women, and children who had been captured, sold, or tricked into bondage. The trip could last weeks, sometimes months, depending on wind and luck. The luck was in short supply. The men were chained in pairs, one man's right leg to another's left to save space. And that's about the only thing the crew tried to save. Women were sometimes allowed a few minutes on deck for air and water, but men stayed locked below because the crew feared organized resistance. Below deck, hundreds of people were packed into spaces so small you couldn't sit up straight. The air was hot, thick, and smelled like death. There was barely any food or water. When disease broke out, it spread like wildfire. To stop the spread of disease and prevent captives from killing themselves, the crew would drag them up for what they called exercise. Of course, it wasn't exercise like we know it. Usually it meant flogging them until they moved, because nobody was exactly inspired to dance for the people who'd ruined their lives. Life below deck was pure misery. People died like flies, and the crew barely kept track. It could take days before they noticed, which meant some poor soul might stay chained to a dead body the whole time. When they finally got around to it, they just dumped the bodies overboard and that was it. One of the most notorious ships was the Brooks, a British vessel from the 1780s. Some drawings of it showed about 400 people squeezed together, lying shoulder to shoulder like cargo. Those images went viral for their time and finally made some people in Britain realize what was happening. Then there was the Zanj. In 1781, the ship ran low on drinking water after storms and leaks. The crew's solution wasn't to ration what they had left. Instead, they decided to throw 130 enslaved people into the ocean so there'd be enough to go around. When they reached Jamaica, the owners tried to file an insurance claim for the lost cargo. That's how the massacre came to light. Not because anyone cared about the people, but because someone wanted reimbursement. The Middle Passage was a nightmare that lasted for centuries, but not everyone went quietly. Some fought back, some refused to eat, and others chose the sea over slavery. In Tier 3, you'll hear about a group that fought back, won, and embarrassed 2 governments in the process. Those who survived the journey were sold in markets and made to work until they couldn't anymore. It's hard to call that survival, but somehow they did it. Slave auctions. You're standing in a town square, surrounded by strangers staring at you like you're an object. You can feel the weight of eyes measuring your body, your every move, and gauging your every reaction. You have no say, no escape, and the only thing that matters to the people around you is how much money they can get from your life. Most of these auctions happened right in town squares or markets, though the real work started long before that. Traders would run ads in newspapers, describing human beings the same way someone might advertise a used horse. There were a few different ways these auctions went down, none of them good. The first was called grab and go. A buyer paid up front, got a ticket, and waited for the drum roll. The moment the drum hit, the doors to the slave pens opened, and chaos followed. Buyers rushed in, literally grabbed people by the arm or neck and dragged them out. They'd show their ticket on the way out, and that was it. Then there was the may the highest bidder win format, which was more organized but no less cruel. Slaves were paraded one by one, sometimes forced to jump, flex, or show their teeth so buyers could check their strength. If more than one buyer showed interest, they started bidding until someone won. And by won, I mean bought another person's life. Before any of these auctions, slaves were prepared to look more appealing to buyers. They were stripped naked and lined up outside to be examined like meat at a butcher's stall. Crewmen and so-called experts poked at their muscles, checked their teeth, and inspected every inch of their bodies. Then came the makeover. They were washed with seawater to freshen up, had their hair shaved to hide gray strands, and were made to drink rum to seem more lively. Their skin was rubbed with oil or animal fat so their muscles would shine. And if someone had open wounds, they'd be filled with gunpowder or rust to make them less noticeable. Slaves who were ill received special treatment to keep things under control. The details are a bit graphic, so let's just say it involved making sure things stayed tidy where the sun don't shine. The whole thing was a production, all aimed at squeezing a higher price out of human suffering. The biggest slave auction in U.S. history happened in Savannah, Georgia in March 1859. It's remembered as the Weeping Time. For 2 days straight, it poured rain, and the enslaved people believed the heavens themselves were crying for them. More than 400 men, women, and children were sold during that rainstorm. The weather didn't slow anyone down. The traders still shouted prices, the buyers still paid, and by the end of it, life just went on. Branding and mutilation. Back in the days of the slave trade, torture was pretty much standard procedure. Enslaved people were branded, whipped, mutilated, or worse, all to make sure they knew their place. Branding was especially popular. Slave traders would heat an iron rod until it glowed, then press it against someone's skin, usually on the chest, back, or shoulder. They did this before the Middle Passage, mostly to mark ownership. Ships carried enslaved Africans from different traders, and so the brands acted like tags that showed which merchant owned which person. Most brands were just initials, but that didn't make it any less horrific. Branding was also used for punishment. A runaway or thief might get another mark as a warning to others. In South Carolina, escaped slaves were branded on the hand with a giant R so no one would miss the message. One man named Reuben was branded across his face with the words, "A slave for life." Another, Henry Owen, carried brands from multiple owners. One set of initials from his old master, and another name carved right into his chest from the new one. As a slave, you could try to run, but if someone came after you, your body would give them everything they needed to get you back to your owner. Mutilation was another way slave owners enforced obedience. Some owners cut off body parts to mark ownership or punish resistance. Toes were a common target. An 1806 newspaper ad described a runaway named Samuel who was missing toes on both feet. Another mentioned a man branded on both breasts and missing several toes. One report from North Carolina described a 30-year-old man who didn't have any visible marks, but was missing both pinky toes. The slavers claimed it was discipline, but in reality, it was a system designed around fear. Every scar, burn, or missing toe served as a reminder of how brutal the system and people could be. Tier 3. The Stono Rebellion. By 1739, South Carolina was sitting on a powder keg. Enslaved Africans who were being treated cruelly at the time made up majority of the population, and most had been brought in during a massive labor boom for rice and cotton. Many of them had come from the Kingdom of Congo, a place where people already knew military structure, Catholicism, and organized resistance. Disease had also swept through Charleston and killed a lot of white colonists, which weakened the system holding everything together. On top of that, Spain kept offering freedom to any enslaved person who escaped to Spanish Florida and converted to Catholicism, and they even set up Fort Mose to receive them. All of this created a clear pressure point, and the enslaved population knew Sunday was the one day slaveholders would be distracted and possibly unarmed. So the conditions were set, and the rebellion was only a spark away. On the morning of September 9, 1739, South Carolina woke up to pure chaos. A group of about 20 enslaved people, led by a man named Jemmy, decided they'd had enough. They gathered near the Stono River in St. Paul's Parish and kicked off one of the biggest slave uprisings the colony had ever seen. It all started when the group broke into a store called Hutchinson's. They killed the two shopkeepers, cut off their heads, and helped themselves to the guns and ammunition. Then they moved to a nearby house, killed the entire family, took whatever supplies they needed, and set the place on fire. It might have looked like blind rage, but it wasn't. They were actually heading somewhere. Their goal was to reach Spanish Florida, and as they marched south, they picked up more people along the way. Before long, there were more than 80 rebels walking down the road, carrying a banner, shouting liberty at the top of their lungs, and banging drums to make sure everyone knew what was happening. By the time they reached Edisto River, they had burned 6 plantations and killed over 24 white settlers. Unfortunately for them, Lieutenant Governor William Bull and 4 other white men happened to ride straight into the rebellion while on their way to Charlestown. They barely escaped and quickly warned other plantation owners that an uprising was underway. By that afternoon, the rebels had been marching for 10 miles and decided to rest in an open field near the Edisto River. They were waiting for more enslaved people to join them when things went south. Somewhere between 20 and 100 white militiamen showed up, ready to fight. The battle was short and bloody. The rebels fired a few shots, but the militia returned heavy fire, killing and injuring 14 of them on the spot. By sunset, at least 30 of the rebels were dead. Another 30 had fled into the woods, and the rebellion was over. The militia then took the heads of the rebels and mounted them on stakes along the road as a warning to anyone else thinking about freedom. Over the next 6 months, the ones who escaped were tracked down and executed. Even though the rebellion was crushed, it terrified the white colonists. In their panic, they passed down a set of laws in 1740 called the Negro Act. These laws made life even harder for enslaved people by restricting their movement, banning education, and limiting their ability to gather in groups. The Igbo Landing. In early 1803, a group of Igbo captives from what is now southeastern Nigeria were taken in by coastal traders. No one knows exactly how they were captured, although village raids were common in that region, so that explanation fits what was happening at the time. These captives were then brought to a major slave ship, which carried a mixed group of West Africans across the Atlantic during that voyage. After surviving the Middle Passage, they arrived in Savannah, Georgia. That was where about 75 of the Igbo captives were sold together to 2 plantation owners, John Cooper and Thomas Spaulding, for roughly $100 each. The buyers had them transferred onto a small coastal boat heading for St. Simon's Island. The slavers thought the worst was over, but the people on board were about to prove them wrong. Somewhere along the way, the Igbo people rose up. They overpowered the crew, took control of the ship, and forced several of their captors overboard. Different accounts tell different stories about what happened next, but they all agreed that the ship eventually got stranded at Dunbar Creek. It got stuck in shallow water and couldn't move any further, and that's where things took a strange turn. The men, women, and children stepped off the boat and walked into the water. As they moved, they sang songs of freedom, chanting, "The water spirit brought us here. The water spirit will take us home." They had made a choice. They refused to live as slaves and walked into the creek together. From that day on, the Igbo Landing became a historical event remembered for its unity and defiance. People still talk about it today. Some locals claim that on quiet nights, faint singing can still be heard near the shore. The Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution kicked off in 1791 and wrapped up in 1804. It began when enslaved Africans working on the French colony of Saint-Domingue on the western part of the Caribbean of Hispaniola, which is now the country of Haiti, decided they were done being worked, beaten, and mistreated for someone else's profit. Saint-Domingue was no ordinary colony. The French were milking it for sugar, coffee, cocoa, and indigo, and they were getting filthy rich while the people doing all the work were treated like disposable tools. The living conditions on these plantations were horrific. Malaria spread like wildfire, and yellow fever wasn't far behind. People were dying like flies, and when the French saw what was happening, they just shrugged and said, well, if they're going to die anyway, we might as well work them to the bone first. The enslaved were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, often with barely enough to eat, nothing to protect them from the weather, and no medical help if they got sick. If they survived, it was a miracle. If they died, the slave masters just bought new slaves to keep the work going. By 1789, the colony was the richest in the Caribbean. Problem was, the enslaved massively outnumbered the white colonists and free people of color. The French kept importing more slaves to keep plantations running, thinking it was a smart business move. But they overlooked the fact that they were dealing with real people who could organize and fight back. The spark came in August 1791. A high priest named Duddy Boakman held a secret meeting in the mountains called the Boys' Cayman. Thousands of enslaved people attended. and Bachmann said enough is enough. Violence erupted almost immediately. Plantations burned, owners were killed, and French children were murdered and put on display. In weeks, over 4,000 white people were dead, and 180 plantations destroyed. Out of all this chaos, Toussaint Louverture rose as the brains and muscle of the revolution. He was a former slave who was smart, strategic, and ruthless when necessary. He built a disciplined army, played the French and Spanish against each other, and by 1801 had abolished slavery in Saint-Domingue. He wrote a new constitution, declared himself governor for life, and tried to cement autonomy for the black population. Napoleon Bonaparte was not amused. At the time, he was first consul, basically the top ruler of France, and he wanted every colony back under tight control, so he sent his forces to crush the revolt. Toussaint and his men fought like hell, but he was eventually captured and shipped off to France, where he died in a cold mountain prison. Even then, the fight didn't end. His lieutenant, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, took command, and the former slaves kept beating the French soldiers who were already weakened by yellow fever and constant attacks. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines declared Haiti independent, using the island's original Taino name, Haiti. Haiti became the first independent black nation in the Americas, and slavery was gone for good. The world had just witnessed the only successful large-scale slave revolt that ended with complete freedom. The Amistad Mutiny. The year is 1839, and a group of Africans find themselves trapped on a Spanish ship called La Amistad. They didn't sign up for this, obviously. Their story started in Medellin, which is now Sierra Leone, when a bunch of slave traders kidnapped them and packed them onto a Portuguese ship named Ticora. That trip was pure hell. The kind that involved being stuffed below deck for 2 months with barely any food or air. Many died from disease or starvation, and the ones who survived were sold off in Havana, Cuba. This was illegal, by the way, since both the US and Britain had already banned the international slave trade at this time. But illegal didn't mean impossible, especially when profit was involved. The 53 survivors were moved onto La Amistad, headed for Puerto Príncipe, where they'd be sold again to plantation owners. And that's when a man named Joseph Cinqué decided to take action. He overheard the ship's cook saying the slaves would be killed and eaten once they arrived. That was all the push they needed. Convinced he was doomed either way, Cinqué started planning an escape. One stormy night in July, he managed to free himself using a nail he'd hidden away. He unlocked the others and they armed themselves with sugarcane knives. Then they went straight for the people in charge. The captain and the cook didn't make it, though Cinqué spared 2 sailors to help steer the ship back to Africa. Except the sailors had other plans. While pretending to follow orders, they quietly navigated north, hoping to reach the American coast. 2 months later, the ship was spotted near Long Island, New York. The U.S. Navy swooped in, seized the vessel, and threw everyone in jail in Connecticut. The Africans were charged with murder and piracy, while the Spanish embassy demanded their return to Cuba, claiming they were legally owned slaves. That kicked off a messy trial. The Africans argued they weren't slaves at all, but free people who'd been kidnapped, and they had every right to fight back. The U.S. president at the time, Martin Van Buren, was all for sending them back, probably hoping to keep things peaceful with Spain. But northern abolitionists had other ideas. They stepped in, rallied support, and helped the Africans get proper lawyers. The case dragged on until it finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 1841. That's when former President John Quincy Adams showed up to argue on their behalf. He basically told the court that these men had been kidnapped and had every right to defend their freedom. In the end, the Supreme Court agreed. The Africans were declared free and allowed to return home to Sierra Leone. The Creole Mutiny. It's November 1841, and 135 enslaved people are packed onto an American ship called the Creole. The plan was simple. Sail them from Richmond, Virginia, down to New Orleans, sell them off, and call it a day. Except things didn't go quite as planned. What happened instead turned a routine slave transport into a major political mess that neither the United States nor Britain was ready for. Among the captives was a man named Madison Washington. He had already escaped slavery once and made it all the way to Canada. But then he did something bold. He came back to Virginia to find his wife, which got him caught and chained up again. During the trip, he started planning another escape, one that would free everyone, not just himself. The enslaved people understood that if they wanted a real shot at freedom, they'd need to move at the right time, stay organized, and hoped luck was on their side, so they let Washington take the lead. They were kept in the cargo hold, but their legs weren't chained. That meant they could walk around the deck when allowed, which turned out to be a huge mistake for the crew. Washington, who worked as the head cook, spent his time quietly watching everything. Who stood guard when, which doors stayed unlocked, and how the sailors moved around. Then came the night of November 7th. Washington and about 18 others decided they'd had enough. They grabbed anything they could use as a weapon. Knives, tools, whatever they could find, and attacked. The crew didn't stand a chance. One of the slave traders got stabbed to death. Several crewmen were injured, and before long, the ship was under new management. Washington and his men told the surviving crew to steer the ship towards the British West Indies. Britain had banned slavery back in 1833, so if they could just reach British territory, they'd be legally free. 2 days later, the Creole arrived in Nassau, which was part of the British Bahamas. Of course, freedom wasn't instant. The American consul, who was basically the U.S. official stationed there, started panicking. He tried to organize American sailors to sneak onto the ship and sail it back to the States, which would have put everyone right back in chains. That little stunt failed miserably. The British authorities stepped in and launched an investigation. After a bit of back and forth, they declared 128 of the 135 enslaved people free. The others were held for questioning because of the man who died during the revolt. Predictably, the Americans were furious and accused Britain of meddling. Meanwhile, abolitionists saw it as a moral victory against the slave trade. So, to sum it up, Madison Washington went from cook to revolutionary leader, turned a slave ship into a freedom ship, and embarrassed the U.S. government all in 1 week. For a man who simply wanted to find his wife, this was one hell of a turn of events. Tier 4. The Barbary Slave Raids. If you thought slavery was just an Atlantic problem, think again. From the 1500s to the early 1800s, pirates from North Africa, better known as the Barbary Corsairs, turned the Mediterranean and even parts of the Atlantic into their personal shopping mall for human beings. They raided coastal towns in Italy, Spain, Greece, and sometimes wandered as far as Ireland and Iceland, snatching anyone they could find. These pirates worked out of the so-called Barbary states, which included modern-day Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, and they operated with the blessing of their local rulers. Their main targets were Europeans, especially Christians, since Islamic law forbade enslaving fellow Muslims. If you were captured and agreed to convert, you could walk free. Otherwise, congratulations. You just won a one-way trip to North Africa. They didn't just raid ships. Entire towns were emptied overnight. In 1631, the Irish coastal village of Baltimore was wiped off the map when a group of Algerian corsairs, led by a Dutch convert to Islam named Jan Janzoon, also known as Ray Murad the Younger, raided the place and kidnapped nearly the entire town. A few years earlier, in 1627, Iceland got hit too. The pirates killed around 50 people and carried off nearly 400 more to North Africa, where most were sold in slave markets. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 1 million Europeans were taken as slaves by the Barbary states. When captives arrived in Algiers or Tunis, they were marched through the streets and locked in prisons, where locals came to gawk at them. The city's ruler would pick out whoever he wanted, and the rest went straight to auction. Their living conditions were brutal. Disease spread fast, people died constantly, and punishment was savage. Some slaves ended up chained to oars on galleys for years, rowing under the sun until they dropped dead. Others were forced into construction work or personal servitude for wealthy families. One of the most famous survivors was Thomas Pellow, an English boy captured at age 11 in 1716. He spent 23 years in Morocco as a slave, endured beatings, forced conversions, and wars before finally escaping. His memoirs gave Europe a first-hand look at just how bad the Barbary trade really was. The raids eventually stopped in the early 1800s after the United States and several European powers got tired of paying ransoms and tribute. They fought back in what became the First and Second Barbary Wars. After that, the Corsairs faded into history, and so did their slave markets. Still, there's no denying the Barbary raids flipped the usual story of slavery on its head. This time, the Europeans were the ones getting chained, beaten, and sold off in foreign lands. Devshirme, the Ottoman child levy. Picture this. You're a Christian farmer in some quiet Balkan village, and one day, the Ottoman officials roll into town with clipboards. Well, the 15th century version of clipboards, and start pointing at kids. That's how the Devshirme system worked. The word itself means collecting in Turkish, and that's exactly what it was, a state-sanctioned child grab. It started under Sultan Murad I in the late 1300s and ran well into the 1600s. The Sultan wanted an army that was loyal only to him. He didn't trust the Turkish nobles much, since they liked power almost as much as he did. His solution was to build a personal army from scratch. So Ottoman officials were sent into Christian territories to collect boys between the ages of 7 and 20. The boys were then shipped off to Istanbul, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the empire. Their parents, of course, had no say. Many of them cried, begged, or even tried to hide their sons, but resistance was futile. The state made the rules clear. Muslim boys were off limits, and married Christian boys were too. So parents got creative. Some mutilated their sons so they wouldn't qualify. Others married them off before puberty. Many even converted to Islam just to save their kids. If a parent refused to hand over a child, they were killed. And if the child ran off, the parents were tortured to death as a lesson for everyone else. Once the boys reached Istanbul, they were sorted into 4 paths: palace service, clerical work, Islamic scholarship, or the military. In rare cases, they got sold as house slaves to wealthy families. The brightest ones usually ended up in the palace schools, trained to become administrators or commanders. Most, however, became members of the empire's elite infantry. They were disciplined, feared, and completely loyal to the Sultan. But before that prestige came the misery. Training was brutal. The boys were beaten into obedience, underfed, and sometimes slept on bare floors. They weren't allowed to talk unless absolutely necessary, and were forced to pray 4 times a day. Any mistake meant they'd be flogged, sometimes over 100 lashes. The goal was to strip them of their identity, family ties, and old religion until nothing was left, except loyalty to the empire. Eventually, the system started falling apart. Ottoman officers began sneaking their own sons into the army instead of taking Christian boys. Muslims started filling roles that used to be reserved for Devshirme recruits. And soon enough, nobody wanted to bother raiding Christian homes anymore. The comfort women of World War II. By the 1930s, while World War II was tearing the world apart, the transatlantic slave trade was mostly history. But slavery itself hadn't gone anywhere. It had just changed shape. The Japanese Imperial Army had its own version called comfort women. The name gives off the wrong idea, seeing how it was actually used to refer to women and girls who were forced into adult work and made to serve soldiers against their will. Thousands of women from Korea, China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and other parts of Asia were taken into this system without consent. Some were tricked with fake job offers that promised good pay, while others were kidnapped outright. They all ended up in places called comfort stations, which were basically brothels run by the Japanese military, where soldiers could walk in and demand a woman like they were asking for a pint of beer. The Japanese government claimed these stations were built to keep soldiers motivated, reduce assaults in occupied areas, and control the spread of diseases. But the people paying the price were innocent women who had no choice in the matter. Living in those stations was the closest thing to hell on earth. The women were dehumanized and called names like female ammunition, military supplies, and in some instances, public toilets. They faced physical and adult abuse every day. Many were forced to serve dozens of soldiers daily, beaten if they fought back, and sometimes even drained of blood to treat the wounded. They were barely fed, lived in poor conditions, and were denied basic health care. Even when they fell sick, they were often refused treatment, and attempts to escape were punished with torture. The women were also forced to move with the army from place to place, following soldiers into active war zones as, can be deadly. Many didn't survive the battles, and some were pushed to take their own lives. One survivor, Kim Hak-sin from Korea, broke her silence in 1991 and told her story to the world. She said she was assaulted on her first day, and that it happened up to 40 times a day. Her courage pushed other women across Asia to come forward and speak up. Another survivor, Fidencia David, from the Philippines, was only 14 when she was taken. She said she cooked, cleaned, and served soldiers while living through constant abuse. The Japanese military claimed the system was for disease control, but that didn't work either. Women were injected with harsh drugs like salvarsan, which was supposed to treat syphilis. Yet infections spread because soldiers refused to use protection. Many women lost their ability to have children due to the drugs and reported trauma. For those who made it out alive, peace never really came. They carried their pain for life and were often turned away by the very families and communities they hoped would take them back. Slavery in Korea. During the Three Kingdoms period about 2,000 years ago, Korean society had already enslaved people. But things became much more organized under the Joseon dynasty, starting in 1392, when the Nobi system became the standard. Now, the Nobi system wasn't identical to the plantation-style slavery people usually imagine. It sat somewhere between slavery and serfdom, which is a system where people weren't owned outright, but they were legally tied to the land and had to work for a landowner, usually for life. You couldn't sell a serf like furniture, but you could inherit them with property. The Nobi system blended pieces of that structure with much harsher controls. Nobi could be bought, sold, punished, or passed down through families, but they also had rights. There were two types of Nobi, resident and out-resident. The out-resident ones were a little better off. They were still slaves, but they could have a home, a family, and even some land to farm. They worked two plots, one for their master and one for themselves. Freedom was rare, but not impossible. You could buy it, earn it through military service, or hope the government felt generous enough to let you go. The Nobi system weakened over the 18th and 19th centuries as criticism grew, and it was eventually abolished, just in time for a new system of exploitation to arrive. Fast forward a few centuries and Korea goes through Japanese colonization from 1910 to 1945. The Japanese occupation brought forced labor and slavery. Many Koreans were made to work in mines, factories, and farms, and women were coerced into serving the Japanese army in comfort stations. It was a harsh system designed to control and exploit people. After the liberation in 1945, Korea split. South Korea eventually modernized, industrialized, and built new labor protections. North Korea, meanwhile, developed into a state built on strict control and surveillance. After finishing school, every North Korean citizen is assigned a job by the state. People work long hours in unsafe conditions with basically no pay, barely enough food, and someone watching them every minute of the day. Punishments range from reduced rations to beatings. Some North Koreans are even sent abroad to work in logging camps, construction sites, and factories. They technically earn wages, but sources say the government keeps up to 90% of it. They live in cramped conditions, under surveillance, and with almost no contact with family. It's a modern form of state-run forced labor, showing that old systems can reinvent themselves whenever power allows it. Migrant slavery in Libya. Modern-day slavery in Libya kicks off differently from the old transatlantic trade, but ends up looking strangely familiar. Victims don't get yanked from their homes at sword point anymore. Instead, they're migrants chasing a better life. Thousands come from Ghana, Cameroon, Sudan, Nigeria, Zambia, Gambia, and Senegal, and they're told they're heading to Europe by boat. Spoiler alert, they're not. They end up in the hands of criminal gangs who smuggle them into Libya. From here, the experience depends entirely on the traffickers. Some migrants are locked in private houses, beaten, and forced to work without pay. Then they are made to call their families, who are told to cough up ransom money. If the family can't pay, the person gets killed, left to starve, or sold off. Some migrants get luckier and land with someone called a commander. They get food, a roof, and protection for a while, before being sold again to other commanders or smuggling rings in different Libyan cities. Either way, their living conditions are terrible. The rooms are filthy, the air is bad, and hygiene is a joke. Many are forced into adult work, which has now become common in Libya. In 2017, the world got a front row seat to the horror show. Footage and reports surfaced of migrants being sold in public auctions. Survivors described men being paraded and bid on like livestock. Prices depended on skills. If someone could paint or dig well, the number went up. CNN went undercover to film it all and showed people being sold for around $400 or less. Since then, Libyan authorities and international partners have tried to shut down the trafficking networks, but the problem refuses to die. Political chaos, the demand for cheap labor, and money-hungry smugglers keep the trade going. Some things never change, even in 2025. When slave trade was at its peak, people endured horrors beyond imagination, and countless others fought, resisted, and even died for the freedom that many have today. We can only cover a fraction of their stories here, but every one mattered. Even now, millions still live in some form of slavery, and their suffering is real. These lives deserve to be remembered and honored. That's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.